Lockdown in Kashmir, protests over a citizenship law in India, coronavirus outbreak, just some of the recent events to make headlines around the world. But how do they impact the global security environment? And what clues do they provide to the direction some countries take? Questions such as these are set to be discussed at one of the world's most well-known and reputable security conferences, the Munich Security Conference, which gets underway today. On today's program, we look at India, its domestic debates, and how that impacts its ambitions on the world stage. Earlier, I spoke to Samir Saran, president of the Observer Research Foundation, or ORF, an Indian think tank headquartered in Delhi. Mr. Saran, thanks so much for making the time. Now, today, India is marking the one-year anniversary of the attack on soldiers in Kashmir that prompted retaliatory Indian airstrikes in Pakistan and is something that raised tensions on either side of the border. How would you describe the current state of India-Pakistan relations?
The airstrikes haven't necessarily changed the longer view of the relationship. They have introduced a new tactical dynamic. I think Pakistan today is far more cognizant of the fact that asymmetric options that it had blatantly been exercising over the past few decades are perhaps going to have a cost attached to it. The Indian response tells Pakistan that terrorist action has a conventional response as a possibility amongst various other options that India has. So it introduces a new tactical uncertainty for Pakistan. Whether that holds is something that time will tell. But I do believe that it was an important moment in introducing a new normal between the two.
But then after that, you had the special autonomy of Kashmir that was withdrawn, and that further raised tension. There was a downgrading of diplomatic ties. Was that necessary? Has that contributed to a worsening of ties?
You know, history will be a good judge of that action. I believe something needed to be done in Kashmir. We could not have allowed it to continue down the same path as it had in the past 7 decades. Some government had to create a new format for engagement, integrating the people with India. This government decided this was the best way to do it. I think you have critiques and you have supporters. But let me put it this way. They got some of the elements right. They are struggling with some other elements.
And isn't the struggle generally for a larger Kashmir policy? It appears that the government is generally focusing on the military option, and that they can't really be, I think it's generally agreed in Indian circles that there can't really be a military option to that. So what is this government's Kashmir strategy?
No, I think the political and muscular option has already been exercised. You have put together a constitutional and a physical presence that integrates the state to India. Now it's time for the development and the economic tools to be deployed and for them to be successful and efficient. You are not going to have a political success until you have an economic, socio-cultural integration. So I think that is the work in progress, and that is where the government has to be far more creative and innovative. That is something that is going to test this government like it has each other government in the past.
Would you say that this is also contributing to a general anti-Pakistan sentiment that is potentially working in the current government's favor in terms of a domestic agenda?
The anti-Pakistan sentiment is perhaps both underplayed and overstated. I think the nature of our birth as two countries in 1947 have introduced a certain nuance to this particular relationship, and those most affected continue to see each other through those times. I suspect that this government's popularity will be based more on its economic policies in the days ahead, based on what it does in terms of providing development and political stability and reviving the Indian economy. I think they are going to be judged on entirely different matrix of performance outcomes than foreign policy or what they do with Pakistan.
All right, let's look at the Munich Security Conference, where one of the themes this time round is the concept of Westlessness, a slow decline, if you like, of the Western-led order that has been in place after the end of the Second World War. Now, if that decline accelerates, would you say in Asia, India comes in to fill that gap, or is it China?
I don't think India is dependent. India's significance in the future is dependent on either the decay of the West or the rise of China. I think India has 1/6 of humanity will play a significant role any which ways. Now, to just spin your question a little bit further, I would argue that this is a good moment. We are going through a silly season across the world. We are having debates on citizenship, on borders, on sovereignty, on multilateralism, on populism, and these are secular debates happening everywhere. I think this is the time for new powers to stake claim towards leadership. In fact, unabashedly, let me put forward a new book that Shashi and I have written, Dr. Shashi Tharoor and I put forward as it's titled The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative, and we argue that based on our largely liberal traditions, our largely market-based economics, our plural and argumentative democracy, it is perhaps time for new actors like India to add their heft to the liberal order, which may not remain that liberal if India was not to be a part of that, and which certainly is not going to be Western as the Asian century progresses. Now, that Western element will have to be replaced by certain new Eastern liberal ideas, and India is best placed and best suited to do that. So I don't think it's Westlessness, but it's going to be West and the East that will have to come up with a template that is far more applicable to the Asian century than to one that was obsessed with the Atlantic and the Atlantic citizens.
But one final question. You talked about liberal order. How liberal is India currently? I mean, is India wearing its earlier badge of honor as being a liberal, tolerant democracy with pride the way it used to earlier, or has that changed a bit?
Well, to me, India is wearing its badge of being a democracy quite loudly. I think every Indian debate is there for the world to hear and participate in. We are using the ballot boxes to express our opinions on key questions. The Indian route to have evolution and not revolutions seems to be still holding. Of course, there is polarization. Of course, there is discontent. Of course, there are those who are dejected. But let me be very clear. I think last week you saw when the incumbent in New Delhi was able to retain his seat, where the central government, the ruling party, had made a determined bid to upstage him. You have also seen the ruling party lose to previous elections, and you are going to see them do well in other elections. I think Indian democracy is using the ballot and its vote to determine its political project, and therefore India should continue to be this fine exception in that particular part of the world where ballots over bullets have always determined its political course.
Samir Saran, pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.